This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.
I sensed an intimacy developing between us in a dimension that we had never experienced before.
Carlen Maddux, you're a journalist, an author, caregiver, speaker, and a Cookvillian, but you're not here now, you're visiting. But you live in St. Pete. Mm-hmm. You have a really incredible story and that you've really shared in this book, A Path Revealed. And really by your name, Carlen Maddux, you reflect a really legacy in our community, in our area. Mm-hmm. Those are family names, I assume.
Yes, my mother's maiden name, Carlen. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And your dad owned Maddux Hardware, right?
He did.
Wow.
And he kept us off the streets by putting us to work there in the summers.
Well, I always bought my sleds and all kinds of things at Maddux Hardware. I really appreciate you taking the time to share with us. This book, A Path Revealed, it's really useful in any crisis, I think, but it really charts your journey through your wife's disease, Alzheimer's. She was diagnosed with early onset Alzheimer's. Can you share that story with us, how this book came to be?
How the book came to be? Have to go pretty far back at this point. As you were talking about, Martha was diagnosed with early onset at age 50, and she had turned 53 weeks before, and but as you were pointing out, the feedback I've gotten from readers is that Alzheimer's is the context of our story. The odyssey that we went through, spiritual odyssey in many ways, is the focus of the story. So there are a lot of guidebooks out there for Alzheimer's, and I didn't need to write another guidebook. They're really good ones, and our particular odyssey seemed to be unique enough that I felt like it was worth getting out. But Martha, just to give you some background, I left Cookeville in 1963 to attend Georgia Tech on a football scholarship. And Martha went to school in Atlanta as well. She's a couple of years behind me. I got to meet her. She was dating my roommate. And my roommate wound up marrying her roommate.
Really?
And then, so later, Martha and I married in 1972. Martha is just a very confident person, passionate person. And we just moved back into St. Petersburg, where she grew up, in 1975 when she was pregnant with our first child. To just show you the kind of energy level she has, which was twice my level. I mean, she just wore me out sometimes. Not long after Martha gave birth to David, our first child, she started working in the local campaign for Jimmy Carter's first presidential campaign. And then subsequent to that, over the years, she ran several local and state campaigns. She had then run for the St. Petersburg City Council in the 80s and served there in the 80s and for 6 years there. And it's just, if she got defeated on something, she was bouncing back up and just going back at it again.
Right, she was athletic, right? You guys,
athletic,
she played tennis.
Had a lot of friends and just very energetic. But in 1996, something changed. She had decided then that she was going to run for the Florida State Legislature. And 3 other candidates were running as well. And I thought, with all the Martha's involvements, that this was really hers to win as long as she did the right
Sure.
things. But they were at the most influential setting in the campaign. The 4 candidates and the audience would ask questions that each candidate had to answer.
So it was like a town hall kind of
that
meeting?
kind of thing. Yeah,
Okay.
and the four candidates were up here at the front and
Right.
just responding. And Martha handled those situations with ease. I mean, she was direct with her answers. She gave common sense answers. But that day, she had to ask for every question to be repeated. And then her answers were rather stilted or scripted, and slightly off the mark. And I had no idea what was going on. And we got home. I said, "Martha, what happened?" And she didn't know. She didn't have a clue what I was
Right.
asking about.
She couldn't remember it,
Didn't,
right?
No. But from that election, she lost that primary by 20 votes.
Wow.
Which, in hindsight, I'm very thankful for.
Right.
But at the time, it was
Right.
disheartening.
Sure.
If we go fast forward a year, Martha had gone to our children and I had asked Martha. She was beginning to forget names and appointments.
Okay.
And we asked her to get to a doctor just to find out, and so we went in and got some tests, and then on this particular day in September of '97, we were sitting there at the desk, at the doctor's desk, wanting to just hear his results. But
Sure.
do you mind if I read something?
Oh,
from my
not
book?
at all. Not at all.
This just sets the it sets the tone.
Well, this
here.
book is so rich, so I really appreciate you doing that. There's so much that I want to talk to you about in
Okay.
here, but your journaling is impactful.
Thank you.
And so I'm sure you can share something that you thought of that day.
Yeah. Well, this was taken from my journal, and this is the opening statements in my book. I say this: September 23rd, 1997. The date is seared in my mind. That day we were scheduled for a follow-up visit with a doctor who had run some tests on my wife, Martha. 2 months earlier, Martha had gone alone for those tests, but she walked out of the doctor's office before even meeting with him. "I got tired of waiting," she said. And that was it, no other explanation, end of subject. And that was typical Martha.
Right.
The previous 18 months had been tough on Martha. She had run for Florida State Legislature as a favored candidate and lost. Then there was a car accident in which she bumped her head, and other stressful issues related to her health, first a DNC, then 2 detached retinas, just weird things. Martha grew lethargic following that political loss, which is so unlike her. And she was just forgetting names and appointments more. But so that brought us to that meeting with the doctor on September 23rd. And how do I describe this? He had a big, massive desk. He was sitting on the other side, and Martha and I were sort of peering over the desk, just very
Anxious.
scared and anxious. And this fella could have passed for Mr. Spock on Star Trek. He was formal, he was cerebral, and he talked to Martha in a monotone voice and said, "It appears that you have early onset Alzheimer's." And his words just froze us. Martha and I looked at each other. We were bewildered. As I was looking to her, as I'm sort of looking at you, she seemed to retreat into her shadow.
Right.
And I don't know if this is in my imagination or literally, but I just saw her bright blue eyes turn dull and gray. And we got out of there as fast as we could. And so that is the precipitating cause behind my book. That's a sort of a long-winded answer to what you were saying, but you were talking about journals. I did. I started doing a journal almost immediately. I didn't do it for, if you're in spiritual terms for spiritual reasons or anything
Right.
else. I didn't do it because I was a journalist. I had so much information coming at me
Right.
from so many directions. I just had to have some central place to keep up with it.
Sure.
And I kept a journal for about a decade until Martha went into a nursing home. And we went through this for about 17 years with Alzheimer's. So I kept a journal and pretty much stopped after 14 volumes.
Wow.
And so when it came time to think about, whatever was urging me to say, Carlen, you've got to put this story together.
Right.
I had not looked at that journal for 4 or 5 years.
Wow.
And I said, okay, if I'm going to do this, I need to go back and sort of revisit something. And that was wrong.
Oh, that's got to be so painful.
That was wrong. And I didn't know, I'm not sure I could have gone forward, but I got over the wrongness and we went forward with putting the book together.
You know, it's a beautiful book.
Thank you.
And I'm grateful that you did that. Because it really does transcend Alzheimer's, to be a spiritual journey for anyone in searching for answers. As a journalist, you probably initially looked for an answer, right? And you can't find an answer when you're in crisis. You can't initially find the solution to the problem.
I didn't understand that at the time.
No, none of us understand that, right? Nobody understands
I was
that.
wanting to find answers, and I wanted to get Martha out of this. I
Right.
wasn't looking for some peaceful state of mind.
Right.
I wanted to get out of this. And the medical community says there's just no hope. There's no answer at this point. But I was reading out in the margins. When you're desperate, you'll go anywhere
Right.
looking for answers, and so I did. Yeah,
Well, it took you on a real spiritual journey, and
surprisingly.
it changed you, didn't it? I mean, this journey really, when I see things about be gentle to yourself,
Yeah,
the advice of entering Gethsemane,
yeah.
those were things that I know you can share some of that, I hope, with us, that you met some real spiritual connectors
Yes.
who helped you find a peaceful path.
Yes, I mean, there are a lot of dots here that I try to connect in the book.
Yes.
But the first sort of opening and by being a spiritual journey or odyssey and being on a path like this, I had no clue that we were on a path
Right.
until really I started seeing that and putting the book together, and I started looking back with where all the dots were connected. But the opening of this, when we got home after Martha's diagnosis, Martha still had a lot of her wit and strength about her. And she said, we are not going to tell anybody. We're not going to tell our children, her parents, our closest friends. But there was one person that she was willing to talk to about it, and that was Reverend Lacey Harwell. And he was a retired Presbyterian minister. And he and Martha had been friends before we married. He married us, baptized a couple of our kids, and we remained friends over the 25 years in the interim. So I called Lacey and asked him to come over, and he said, I'll be over tomorrow. And I am 6'5". Lacey is about 6'4", and he packed a lot more pounds on him than I did. And he's a big man, but he was an even bigger than life kind of guy.
Right.
We invited Lacey in, and Martha and I were sitting on a couch together, and Lacey in a chair opposite us. And Martha nodded at me to start the conversation, and it wasn't a long conversation. I said, Lacey, we've asked you here to just let you know that Martha's been diagnosed with Alzheimer's. And this bigger than life man, I could see just sort of shrink in this chair. And he asked to swap seats with me, which we did. And he put his big arms around Martha, and they hugged, and we all cried. And there was just silence for a long time. And then he said, you know, I have a good friend in Kentucky at a community called the Sisters of Loretta, and her name is Sister Elaine Prevalet. I have sent a lot of my friends and a lot of people in my church to visit with her who are going through a crisis.
Mm-hmm.
And I would just really encourage you to think about going to visit her. I don't know what will come of it. I am pretty certain it would be very meaningful for you. And the reason I have sent so many friends there, I just have not met anyone else with her gift of discernment, if you want to call it that.
Right.
That she's just really a wise woman. And so after telling us that, Lacey got up and left, and Martha and I talked about that. And I called Sister Elaine the next day, and we got up there 3 weeks after Martha was diagnosed. And that was sort of where this path began to open.
The spiritual journey.
Yeah.
I just want to remind folks that Martha had just turned 50.
Yes.
You had a daughter in high school, 2 children in college.
Yes.
You were in your 50s?
I was a couple of years older than Martha, 52.
52.
And I was publishing a business magazine there in the Tampa Bay area.
That was called the Maddux Report, is that right?
Interestingly, it got me in a lot of trouble, but
No. So my goodness, you, I know at this point, thought you had some really incredible years ahead of you.
Absolutely.
And you were really college sweethearts that remained sweethearts.
Well, not in college. We became sweethearts after
Later
college.
after
Her roommate married.
Oh, gotcha. Okay. So how did you handle that disappointment?
Of
Just knowing from that moment, even though you didn't really know what the journey would be, you knew that your life was going to change.
Our life was not turned upside down. It was imploding before us. And how did we handle that? At that time, I couldn't have told you what direction we were going in. But when we went to visit with Sister Elaine, we were there for a week with her. And I'm 6'5". Sister Elaine was probably 5'1" if she was stretching it. But you stood at attention when she came in.
Right.
But she was a very warm person. We would talk with her for about an hour in the morning, and then she just left us to our own for the rest of the day. And her eyes are what I really remember about her. I don't remember the color, but they were warm and they were penetrating in a positive, sort of unfolding kind of a way. And she talked to us about several things. I mean, one of the things she mentioned to us both is, without getting into great detail, she said, you might want to check out the difference between being willing and being willful. Mm-hmm. I mean, Martha had been in politics. I was an entrepreneur, magazine publisher.
Right.
And if there's nothing if there's nothing else but willful enterprises, those things are. I had no idea what she was talking about. And so that contrast, willfulness versus willingness, really marked the trail for us as we went forward. And as I look back on it, I bounced back and forth between these rails of those willing and willful through the next 17 years, and still am.
Sure.
But we left there. Her parting words, I'm not quoting directly, but it says, you now belong to God and not to yourselves. And you need to try to understand God's love for you and the love that you have between yourselves. And I remember thinking, I said, well, that should be easy enough. So, couldn't have been more naive with my own insights, but naivete defined this process for me a lot of the way through, in terms of thinking that, well, we can do that easily.
Sure.
So we got back home, and I was reading a lot of material at the time.
Right.
I'd been reading Thomas Merton's book on meditation. It was a little complicated for me. I grew up in a Protestant background, and Protestants don't meditate. I mean,
Right.
they didn't then, and maybe and some more now, but not a lot. There was
Right.
more of a tradition out of the Catholic Church. And that was one of the things that Sister Lane had said, you might want to look into meditation.
Mm-hmm.
And so when we got back, we met with Lacey Harwell again,
Right.
and brought him up to speed. And I said, Lacey, can you tell me anything about meditation? Because Sister Lane was telling us to check it out.
Right.
And so he said, I know of one man, a Benedictine monk, who is about the simplest and most authoritative with this that he's come across. So his name is John Main, and I went online and found a book of his and found tapes of his.
Mm-hmm.
And Martha and I began to meditate, and like 15 to 20 minutes in the morning and 15 to 20 minutes in the evening, whenever we could. And nothing happened initially, but over time, I just felt the anxiety within us diminishing.
Right.
The other thing I began to sense was we would sit on the couch together and we would hold hands as I would silently whisper our word. And I sensed an intimacy developing between us in a dimension that we had never experienced before.
Sure.
And it was just a wonderful kind of
Connectivity.
connection, of communication, a nonverbal kind of communication.
Right.
And so that began to open up other paths for us as well.
You know, I think I just learned so much from reading this, and the importance of forgiveness. You talk about that a lot, and we're going to run out of time before I have the chance to ask you all the things I want to, but there were a couple of other things, and if you have one more thing to share before we leave, I definitely want you to have time. Some of the other things that moved me when I was reading your book about healing is God's gifts and promises for us, that perfection is within you, that why ask for what you've got? You have what you accept. I learned a lot from the things you share. Also the fact that your book has a rich appendix of other really wonderful spiritual readings.
Yeah.
What would you like for folks to leave with at the end of this interview? What's the most important thing for you, for them to know?
Wow.
That's a tough one, isn't it?
In its simplest form, I would tell you that as I look back over the 17 years, I grew up in a church. I continued into my adulthood into a church, except for a few years in my 20s when I was going through my questioning period, as many people do. I would leave at least myself, this is what I left myself with, and I'm still working on this, is there is a vast difference between believing in God and in believing God. If I may just read this quick passage out of my epilogue, explains this difference that I see between believing in God versus believing God. And it goes like this: my struggle to focus on the attributes of God's kingdom echoes my struggle to follow Jesus' charge in Mark's gospel. And you shall love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your mind and with all your strength. I wrestled with that directive long before Martha's illness. I tried to obey it, but felt no emotional oomph. Through my encounters with Christ, however, it finally dawned on me that trying to love an all-powerful, all-knowing, all-seeing, infinite, invisible, perfect being we call God is futile. Seeking to understand why and how God loves me has proved much more fertile. I realized, and this came very slowly, that Jesus' command mirrors God's commitment to me. Jesus' command mirrors God's commitment to me. The more I recognize this fact, the easier I'm able to respond in similar fashion. I can love God only to the degree that I know that God loves me. I can humble myself before God only to the point that I see God's humility expressed toward me. I can trust God only to the extent that I realize I've been entrusted with God's name and image. In other words, I'm able to heed Jesus' command with all that I am only when I know and feel deep within that God loves me with all his heart, soul, mind, and strength. And only then do I understand that this command is not a command at all. It's a promise. Carlen, you shall love the Lord your God.
That's wonderful. Carlen Maddux, Path Revealed. You also have a great website, yep. carlenmaddux.com.
Right.
Thank you for this time.
Thank you.
Thank you for this book.
You bet.
All right.
Thank you. All right.
And welcome home.
Welcome home. All right.
This program was made possible by contributions to your PBS station from viewers like you. Thank you.